This is Unit 8, Part 2. We're going to start moving from the proximal end of the digestive system, the mouth. We'll move along anatomically towards the distal end, which is the rectum, and describe the functions and the structures of the different parts, including accessory organs that contribute digestive enzymes or secretions into the digestive tract. This is a diagram showing a mid-sagittal section through the head and neck, the anterior part of the head and neck, and it shows the oral cavity with the tongue inside, and the roof of the oral cavity is made up of the hard palate and the soft palate. The hard palate has the bony part, that's why it's hard, and the soft palate does not have bone. We'll go through this in more detail on later slides. So let's start in on looking at different structures. The mouth itself is the oral or buccal cavity. It has to be able to handle abrasions, friction, rubbing from food and other things that are stuck into the mouth. So it's lined with a type of an epithelium similar in many ways to the epithelium on the outside skin. So it's multiple layers, which means it's going to be called stratified. It has multiple layers, not a single simple epithelium. It's a stratified epithelium, and it is squamous. These are flat cells that get sloughed off. So the surface is constantly getting sloughed off, and new cells are replacing them from below. The gums, the hard palate, and the dorsal side of the tongue, which is the upper part, is slightly keratinized, which means that it is made of cells that are flattened out, squamous, and are actually the very top layer are dead and will constantly turn over and get sloughed off. In that way, you're constantly replacing the surface of the gums, the hard palate, and the dorsal side of the tongue. And the whole mouth also is lined with that kind of stratified squamous epithelium, which is keratinized. Okay, so as I was saying, this is the diagram of the oral cavity or buccal cavity, and the hard palate is up here. It has bone underneath it. So all up here in this area, that's the hard palate, and the soft palate, which doesn't have bone. There's the uvula hanging down, part of the soft palate. Behind, you have in here on either side tonsils, which are mucosal associated lymphoid tissue. These are lymphoid organs. Here's the tongue and the frenulum, and these are the openings, ducts leading from the salivary glands, the submandibular salivary glands. All of the gums are called gingiva, so gums on either side, just above and below the teeth. The tongue takes up most of the oral cavity, and it's involved in holding, repositioning food, mixing the food with saliva to form what's called a bolus. A bolus is one unit or chunk of material. So you can have a bolus of food being swallowed. You can inject a bolus. Injecting a bolus into a person means you're injecting some sort of fluid all at once together. So sometimes they'll inject a bolus of isotonic saline. Tongue's also, of course, involved in swallowing and speech. And here you see that the tongue, and nobody's tongue actually looks like this, but what they're trying to do is emphasize the fact that you have these structures called papilla on the tongue, and in the space down below here in this kind of groove here, that's where the taste buds lie, down below, and we'll see that in a minute, I believe. Oh, maybe we'll go through that later when we do sensory organs. Now, the salivary glands produce and secrete saliva. These are exocrine organs. They help cleanse the mouth, moisten food, and help dissolve food. They help in the formation of a ball of food that you've chewed up, and by wetting it, formed it into a bolus that you can swallow. And quite importantly, they contain an enzyme that's involved in the breakdown of starch, and that is salivary amylase. The reason it's called salivary amylase is because there's another amylase that comes from the pancreas called, not surprisingly, pancreatic amylase. There are more than just 2 salivary glands. In fact, there are 3 different pairs of salivary glands: the parotid, the submandibular, and the sublingual. There are also very tiny intrinsic salivary glands called buccal glands scattered throughout the mucosa, the epithelial lining the mucosa of the oral cavity. But as discrete organ structures, the parotid, the submandibular, and the sublingual salivary glands, in pairs, are quite important. And here you see, from one side at least, the parotid salivary gland here. This is the parotid gland. It's in the cheek here. The submandibular is, as it says, below the mandible, which is the jaw. So we're sorry, that's the duct. The submandibular gland is below the jaw here. That's the submandibular, and it arches around like that. And the duct leading into the oral cavity, which drains, the duct drains saliva from the submandibular gland into the oral cavity just beneath the tongue on one side or the other of the frenulum. And that duct is shown in green here. I'm going to point it out here. Right there, there's the duct. Okay, leading out into the outer space of the oral cavity. It's an exocrine gland, so exocrine glands secrete their product to the outside of the body. Endocrine glands always secrete their product into the bloodstream, into the body. So that's the parotid gland, the submandibular gland, and the submandibular duct. And then there's the sublingual gland, which is under the tongue, and that is positioned here. You can see it, the sublingual gland. Okay, so 3 pairs: parotid, submandibular, and sublingual, secreting fairly important fluid containing the enzyme salivary amylase. The secretion comes from both mucus cells in the salivary gland, which secrete mucus, and serous glands, which secrete the digestive enzyme and some proteins. So saliva itself is somewhat slightly acidic solution, mostly water, of course. It contains some electrolytes, the enzyme salivary amylase, and it contains all of these proteins, which the first one is called mucin. Mucin is an important protein to know because mucin, in fact, is the protein which, when it comes into contact with water, becomes mucus. All right, so mucin with water becomes mucus. So these glands, the cells in these glands produce the protein mucin. These other ones, lysozyme, defensins, and IgA, are all involved in immunity and protection against microorganisms that might get into and colonize the oral cavity. Control of salivation is interesting. Very strong sympathetic stimulation will inhibit salivation. You need to be able to understand what sympathetic stimulation is. This is, well, there's two types of stimulation that can occur, sympathetic and parasympathetic. I'm going to write that out for you. So sympathetic and parasympathetic. Now, organs that are not consciously controlled are under the control of a system called the autonomic nervous system. Okay? And there are two divisions to that autonomic nervous system: the sympathetic division and the parasympathetic division. And these will stimulate at different times different unconsciously controlled tissue. So sympathetic and parasympathetic stimulation will have different effects on different tissues. These are, as I said, unconsciously controlled tissue. So we're not talking about skeletal muscle, which is consciously controlled. We're talking about unconsciously controlled things that you cannot actually control. And one of the types of tissues that you cannot control consciously are the salivary glands. And the output from the nervous system comes from the autonomic, let's just leave it as autonomic nervous system, the ANS. And the autonomic nervous system, as I said, has two divisions, the parasympathetic and sympathetic division. So output from the sympathetic division would be sympathetic stimulation. Output from the parasympathetic division would be parasympathetic stimulation. And these two will upregulate or downregulate. It depends what tissue you're looking at, what kind of organ you're looking at. Often the sympathetic upregulates, but sometimes it inhibits. And often the parasympathetic inhibits, but sometimes it stimulates. It really depends on the organ you look at. In the case of salivary glands, sympathetic stimulation, output of the autonomic nervous system through the sympathetic division, will cause inhibition of salivation and result in a dry mouth. What you need to realize is that you have sympathetic stimulation. The sympathetic division is stimulated when you are scared, need to respond immediately. This is called the fight or flight response. So that's when you're very aware and suddenly stimulated, and it will have output, for example, to the heart. It causes, and the heart is a unconsciously controlled organ, so it's controlled by the autonomic nervous system. the heart rate will speed up with sympathetic stimulation. When you get scared or when you have to suddenly you get stimulated, so you have to act immediately, you have the fight or flight response, you have a sympathetic stimulation of the heart, and it will speed up the heart. Parasympathetic stimulation occurs when you're relaxed. Okay, this is not the fight or flight response. This is the absolute opposite. Parasympathetic. And in this case, if we're talking about the heart, it slows down the heart. If we're talking about the salivary glands, it increases saliva output. After all, you produce saliva when you're going to eat or you're thinking about eating and you're relaxed. And sympathetic stimulation for salivary glands will inhibit salivation. That's why people who are nervous will have a dry mouth. They get nervous, they have a dry mouth. Often you'll see that they lick their lips when they're nervous because of that sudden dryness in their mouth. Okay? So, the salivary glands produce saliva in response to taking in food or thinking about food. The food that is taken in can stimulate chemoreceptors and pressor receptors in the gastrointestinal tract. Pressor receptors respond to the pressure mechanical widening or stretching of the GI tract. All right. We're not going to do a lot about teeth. I will mention a few things. You have two sets of teeth, primary, which are deciduous. They fall out, so they're called either primary or deciduous teeth. And then you have the permanent teeth following that. So when you're young, quite young, you have primary or deciduous teeth, and they usually break through the gums anywhere from starting at 6 months of age up to 24 months, and they will be kept and used by the child until the permanent teeth come in. So then the deciduous teeth fall out and the permanent teeth come in, and that can happen over several years, between the ages of 6 and 12 years, that the deciduous teeth are lost and permanent teeth move in. There is a third set of molars further back, further posterior in the oral cavity. These are wisdom teeth. They'll erupt towards the end of adolescence. So in later teen years, the wisdom teeth erupt. Usually, people will have 32 permanent teeth overall, total. Here you see a diagram. I'm not going to get into the details of deciduous teeth, occasionally called milk teeth, but they are the primary or deciduous teeth, and these are the permanent teeth. This, by the way, is the lower jaw, I believe. But I'm not, again, going to go into any great detail. There are two major regions to tooth, the crown and the root. The crown is the area that you see that's exposed above the gums or gingiva. It's covered with enamel, which is an extremely hard material made of calcium and hydroxyapatite. The root is the part that's embedded down below the gum line and into the jawbone. That's the root portion, and the root canal is the central canal area here, which contains blood vessels and nerves. So that's the main structure of a tooth, the crown and the root. Right in this area, that's the neck. So the crown, the neck, and the root, just right at the gum line, the first initial part. The neck is, as I said, where the crown and the root come together. Dentin is a bone-like material that's underneath the enamel cap that makes up the majority of the tooth. So everything in this diagram in blue, all this area shown in blue, is all dentin. So it makes up the majority of the overall root, the overall tooth. As I said earlier, the root canal is an area where you have blood vessels and nerves, and inside of it is pulp. Okay, inside the root canal is pulp, which is connective tissue, blood vessels, and nerves. Okay. Teeth and gums can have problems. Cavities are in fact called dental caries due to the action. They occur because of the action of bacteria releasing acids that demineralize the enamel and expose the dentin and form a hole into the dentin. On the surface of teeth, if they're not cleaned properly, it will accumulate fairly quickly. On the surface is dental plaque, which is a thin surface film of carbohydrate material. That's why it says sugar. So carbohydrates, bacteria, and food debris that can attach quite tightly to the surface of the tooth and provide an area where the bacteria can multiply and produce acid and dissolve, form a hole in the enamel and cause further damage into the dentin. So daily flossing and brushing helps to remove that bacterial dental plaque. Okay. After the mouth is the pharynx, which allows movement of food and fluids to the esophagus and air down to the trachea. It is just like with the buccal cavity, it's lined with stratified squamous epithelium, and there are mucus secreting glands along it. Beneath that surface epithelium, you have skeletal muscle layers. So skeletal muscle, of course, is under voluntary control. So you voluntarily control the muscles in your pharynx, and that's what allows you to swallow. Going further down past the pharynx, you get into the esophagus, which is a muscular tube moving down from the pharynx to the stomach. It travels through the diaphragm, that thin layer of muscle that separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity, and then it meets up with and empties into the stomach. The esophagus is lined with smooth muscle, not skeletal muscle. Smooth muscle is not under voluntary control, it's under unconscious, involuntary control. It also has a layer of stratified squamous epithelium because it's also subject to a lot of abrasion and so needs to be able to, renew itself and slough off the surfaces, so it's multi-layered or stratified. When it's empty, it collapses, it's flat, and there are glands that secrete mucus all along the esophagus to help the bolus of food, the one bolus after another each time you swallow, to help it move along. As I said, there is a layer of muscle underneath, and it is smooth muscle. Okay, let's talk more. We'll talk about the digestion process in the mouth. It is initiated in the mouth. Food's taken in or ingested, and then mechanical digestion begins by chewing. Another term for chewing is mastication. Okay, so it's mechanically digested at first by chewing it into smaller pieces. Bolus of food is formed with the tongue and saliva, and it's swallowed down into the esophagus. And once it gets into the esophagus, there's a series of reflexes that help push it down. As swallowing is initiated, reflexes help move it down. The chemical digestion actually begins in the mouth because the saliva contains salivary amylase, a enzyme that can break down starch. So swallowing, another term for swallowing is deglutition. This is a coordinated action of the tongue, the soft palate, the pharynx, the esophagus, and quite a few groups of muscles. So it's quite a carefully coordinated action of all these muscles together. As you swallow something, it all has to act in the right sequence of events, which is why often people who have a stroke can have trouble swallowing, which is a problem, because if they can't swallow properly, they could take food or fluid into their trachea, and that's a problem. The first phase of swallowing or deglutition is the buccal phase, in which the food bolus is forced back into the oropharynx. There's several regions of the pharynx. There's the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx, each one going further down. The oropharynx is where food is pushed into at the back of the throat. The next phase after the buccal phase is the pharyngeal esophageal phase, which is controlled by part of the brain stem, these two parts of the brain stem, the medulla and the pons. What happens is that in this pharyngeal esophageal phase is that any route other than down through into the esophagus is sealed off. So you cannot swallow down into your trachea because the trachea gets sealed off, and you cannot get food going up into your nasopharynx because that gets also closed off. After that, reflex action, localized movement of muscles, which is called peristalsis, and we've discussed before, helps to move the food down through the oropharynx to the esophagus, and down the esophagus to the stomach and onwards. So here you see a diagram showing swallowing or deglutition, where you have this bolus of food in the mouth being formed and pushed back into the oropharynx area and then getting swallowed down. Notice in this second phase or second part of the diagram here that what's happening also is that the epiglottis is closing over the opening of the trachea so that the food cannot go into the trachea. Here the epiglottis is open, but as the swallowing is initiated and the food's pushed back into the oropharynx at the back of the throat, the epiglottis closes and the food gets swallowed and pushed down into the esophagus. At that point, the epiglottis can open so the person can breathe. And peristalsis is initiated and the food is pushed down, moved down the esophagus and into the stomach. And the peristalsis is shown by these arrows indicating that there's contraction, and that contraction is occurring in a wave, moving downwards and squeezing the food bolus down into the stomach. And all of that, what I just explained, is shown here on the in the text all along here. Okay, So once the food moves down into the stomach, chemical breakdown of the proteins in the food begins. And the food is converted into a thick kind of a paste called chyme. There are two regions to the stomach, two major regions, the cardiac region and the pyloric region. The stomach actually ends in what's the structure called the pylorus, which is continuous with the duodenum. There is area at the junction between the stomach and the duodenum. By the way, the duodenum is the first region, the initial first region of the small intestine. There's an area at the junction between the stomach and the duodenum which has a thicker wall, and that's the pyloric sphincter. So a sphincter is an area that can contract, an area of muscle, smooth muscle, that can contract and close off the passageway. And normally that the gastrointestinal tract or GI tract, the pyloric sphincter is contracted so that the stomach and the duodenum are kept separate by closure of that sphincter. As food is processed through the stomach, once it's ready to move into the duodenum, there's a relaxation and a little bit of food is let through, or not food, but chyme at this point. It's called chyme. Some of that paste is allowed through, and then it contracts again to seal it off. So chyme is passed through when it's ready to be passed through. It's passed through from the stomach into the duodenum by relaxation, opening of the pyloric sphincter. And here you see the cardiac area up here and the pyloric area further down at the base, and there are sub areas, but I don't want to get into that too much. The actual inner surface of the space of the stomach has all of these folds. They're called rugae. They're folds because the stomach can stretch. As it fills with food, it stretches out. So when it's empty, there are folds. Beneath that, you have these layers of muscle tissue, smooth muscle tissue. That's the muscularis externa. You have three layers: a longitudinal layer, a circular layer, and an oblique layer. Here's the longitudinal layer in the direction of the progression of the GI tract. The circular layer going around. There's the longitudinal layer, the circular layer, and an oblique layer at an angle to that. And contractions of each of those layers helps food get mixed up with enzymes and acid that's present in the stomach, and helps to form it into what's called chyme. And then you have, of course, the pyloric sphincter, which acts as a valve and is normally contracted, but when food can be allowed through, it relaxes and allows some of that chyme paste down into the duodenum. Okay, so I think I'll keep going to the end here. We have 15 slides left. All right, all along the wall of the stomach are small glands. These are invaginations, very small. You can only see them with a microscopic slice of the wall. And the diagram here shows that. Here's the surface epithelium here of that's the surface, the inner surface of the stomach, and all along you have these invaginations, these glands that come down. They're surrounded by lamina propria, And you should understand that the surface of that duct that dives down is a continuation of the surface epithelium of the stomach. So it's really just sort of specialized kind of epithelial cells that have different specialized functions, and it's diving down into the surrounding connective tissue, the lamina propria, and beneath that you have the muscularis mucosa. All of that forming the mucosal layer, the innermost layer of the stomach. And remember, beneath that you have a submucosa, and then beneath that you have the muscularis externa, which in this case has 3 muscle layers. And of course outside of that you have the serosa. So if we look at a higher magnification at the gland, the initial duct area has surface epithelial cells lining it, and then you get into an area that has mucus secreting neck cells. So mucus neck cells are present. There are also parietal cells. There are gastric glands. Well, no, I'm sorry. The gland refers to the entire structure. Okay, this whole tunnel-shaped invagination tunneling down into the mucosa is the gland itself. So that refers to the whole area. The specialized cells include, as I was saying, initially there's the surface epithelial cells. You have the mucus neck cells, the parietal cells, and chief cells within that gland. The mucus neck cells, of course, secrete mucus. It's an acidic mucus, but it is a mucus, not highly acid, and it does act to protect the surface epithelium of the stomach from the action of the enzymes and the hydrochloric acid that's produced. Parietal cells are secreting hydrochloric acid. This is hydrochloric acid. They also are producing a protein called intrinsic factor, which helps with vitamin B12 absorption. Without that, you can't get vitamin B12 absorption. So the parietal cells are producing, and it's shown here in this diagram, that the parietal cells, which is this cell in blue, I'll outline it here, this blue colored cell, produces hydrochloric acid. Here's another one on the other side of the gland, and it's producing hydrochloric acid. Hydrochloric acid acts on a protein produced by the chief cell. Okay, there are chief cells, not only parietal cells producing hydrochloric acid and intrinsic factor, but also chief cells in the duct, which produce a protein, an enzyme, which is inactive. It's called pepsinogen. When a enzyme ends in OGEN, like pepsinogen or trypsinogen or chymotrypsinogen, there's all kinds of examples of that. It means that it's in its inactive form. The hydrochloric acid will activate it into active enzyme called pepsin. I didn't mention another type of cell which lines the duct, which is called an enteroendocrine cell. I forgot that. The enteroendocrine cell, they're at the base, and they can produce hormones that will get secreted not so much into the space, but also into the bloodstream, into blood vessels that are further into the body tissues. And we'll talk about that soon enough. Okay. So we have the further out from the submucosa, you have the muscularis externa, allowing for the stomach to churn and mix and pound away, pummel the food and break it down into smaller bits and mix it up with the enzymes and the mucus to form chyme. Epithelial lining of the gland includes the mucus secreting cells, which have their own particular name called goblet cells. Goblet cells are the cells that produce mucus. This is this is an alkaline kind of mucus. Further down in, you have the acid mucus secreting cells. There's a reason why it's alkaline. It helps, when it's alkaline, it has a high pH, obviously. This helps protect the surface epithelium of the stomach from the very acid hydrochloric acid. The gastric glands themselves, further down, past that initial epithelial lining, secrete gastric juice, which is a mixture of the acid mucus and a hormone called gastrin, which goes into the bloodstream, and the hydrochloric acid and the pepsinogen from the parietal cells, the chief cells. Okay, so inside the stomach is a very harsh conditions, and ordinarily it would, if it didn't have that barrier of alkaline bicarbonate rich, bicarbonate is alkaline, the alkaline mucus, it would digest itself. The epithelial cells lining it not only have that layer of alkaline mucus protecting them, but they also have tight junctions which prevent any entry of the gastric juice acids down between the cells. The glands have cells that are impermeable to the hydrochloric acid, and any epithelial cells that are damaged will be quickly replaced at the surface and down into the duct. They quickly get replaced. And here you see a better enlarged view, and again, mucosa, submucosa, muscularis externa, and at the very end, serosa. But here are these three major layers, of course, that make up the typical wall of areas, different areas of the GI tract. And here you see that this initial part of these glands is called the gastric pit. That's lined by the surface epithelial cells, and that has the goblet cells in it. These are epithelial cells, but they also include among them some goblet cells secreting that alkaline mucus. Then further down, we're into the glandular area, which is secreting material from the mucous neck cells, a more acid kind of mucus. Parietal cells secreting hydrochloric acid. Chief cells secreting the pepsinogen, and of course the enteroendocrine cells further down. The pepsinogen released by the parietal cells is activated by hydrochloric acid. Hydrochloric acid cleaves or cuts it so that now you have an active enzyme called pepsin, and pepsin is able to break down protein. It has enzymatic activity on protein and can cleave the peptide linkages between particular amino acids. The enteroendocrine cells that I've mentioned are able to produce different kinds of hormones, and these get secreted into the bloodstream. So they're not going into the glandular space that leads up into the space of the, going up that duct and into the space of the stomach itself, but it gets secreted into the tissues the lamina propria and into blood vessels there, and they include the secretion of gastrin, CCK, which is cholecystokinin, and some other secreted molecules. The two key ones that I'll talk about in a few minutes are gastrin and cholecystokinin, CCK. So the stomach receives food that was taken in and has already been partially mechanically digested. The contractions of the stomach help further mechanically digest it. It's also started chemical digestion because of the salivary amylase, and also now the action of pepsin on proteins. So it's undergoing some, the carbohydrate starch is undergoing some digestion due to the action of salivary amylase. The protein is undergoing some digestion due to the action of pepsin. The material is also being chemically acted on by the hydrochloric acid that's present in the stomach, which was released from chief cells in the gastric glands. And this converts that food into chyme, and chyme will get delivered into the small intestine. Here it's that information about the intrinsic factor and vitamin B12 that I mentioned earlier. Okay, now there are nerve-related and hormone-related mechanisms that regulate release of gastric juice, that combination fluid material of mucus, hydrochloric acid, pepsin, that's gastric juice. There are three phases which depend upon location of the food. When the stomach is empty and before any food enters, the stomach is in a cephalic phase. Once food enters into the stomach, it goes into the gastric phase, and then as the food is converted into chyme, it gets delivered by relaxation of the pyloric sphincter into the duodenum, and that's the intestinal phase. And we'll go through each of these phases on the next few slides. The cephalic phase, when you have an empty stomach, starts with an excitatory event, the sight or thought of food or stimulation because of taste or smell, sensory receptors being activated. Those are the kinds of things that can excite the cephalic phase of food process. The initial, thought of food, hunger, smell, taste. It can be inhibited. The cephalic phase can be inhibited by a loss of appetite due to, fatigue, depression, person not feeling right, any decrease of parasympathetic division. Remember, the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. The other one is the sympathetic division. The parasympathetic occurs when you're relaxed. You have to be relaxed in order to enter into that initial cephalic phase of, wanting to be interested in food. If there's a decrease, then that is inhibitory. So if there's a decrease in the parasympathetic output, then you'll inhibit the cephalic phase. Gastric phase occurs as the stomach starts to fill, as a person is eating and swallowing, and the stomach gets stretched out or distended. You get activation of nerve receptors that are responsive, sensory receptors that respond to stretching, and that will activate those receptors. There's also activation of chemoreceptors that are activated by the presence of small protein peptide, pieces of peptide. There's also caffeine can activate chemoreceptors. All of these events will trigger entry into the excitement of the gastric phase. A rise in pH, the stomach contents is at a low pH, and when food goes in, the food's at a neutral pH, so it causes an overall rise in the pH, and that can also trigger the excitatory phase. All of that will trigger release of gastrin from the enteroendocrine cells in the gastric glands, and the gastrin, of course, is it's enteroendocrine cells, so it's a hormone, so it goes into the blood. The gastric phase can be inhibited if the pH remains at a low level, at 2 or even lower. If the person is upset, or as I said before, depressed, all that can override parasympathetic activation, which is required for gastric phase. The intestinal phase occurs, gets activated if there is partially digested food entering into the duodenum. So if the duodenum, the first section of the small intestine, if the pH starts to drop, that's because of the more acid chyme that's entering into it. And that will encourage gastric gland activation and increase activity of gastric glands. The enteroendocrine cells and the other cells in the gastric gland will be more excited during this intestinal phase as food starts moving into the duodenum. If there's inhibition, it's because the duodenum is stretched. So if the duodenum is full and hasn't been able to process that material yet, then you get inhibition of the intestinal phase. So the activity in the stomach will slow down. It won't speed up again. It won't get excited again or upregulated again until the duodenum empties partly. If there's presence of fatty or acidic chyme, or actually hypertonic chyme in the duodenum, that can also inhibit the intestinal phase and activity of the gastric gland. And inhibition will close the pyloric sphincter so that more material doesn't move from the stomach into the duodenum, because after all, the duodenum is full at this point. There's fatty or acidic or hypertonic chyme in it, and that's going to slow down the pyloric, the intestinal phase, and processing of food in the stomach, and keep the pyloric sphincter closed until the duodenum is available. This also causes, this inhibitory phase will cause release of hormones that can inhibit gastric secretion. And all of these events that I've talked about so far, the cephalic phase and the gastric phase of the stomach and duodenum, cephalic phase, gastric phase, intestinal phase, all these phases are described in more detail here, but the key parts are present, and you have stimulatory events and inhibitory events, and I've emphasized the ones that I think are key. So all physiological systems are regulated. I've already spoken about how some regulation occurs, but let's talk about more specifically regulation of hydrochloric acid secretion from the chief cells. It can be stimulated by a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine. It can also be stimulated by the hormone gastrin. So remember, gastrin is produced and released into the bloodstream by the enteroendocrine cells, and has an effect on secretion of the stomach, and will upregulate, in fact, the secretion of hydrochloric acid in the ducts of the stomach. So if any one of these signals is present, but only one, then secretion of hydrochloric acid is at a low level. If, however, all three are present, including histamine, then secretion occurs at a high level. So with eating and swallowing, the stomach starts to fill, it starts to relax, to receive more food, and can relax and stretch out to a certain extent, but will be full and will keep relaxing, and eventually it will fill. So as it relaxes, there's no increase in pressure because the organ gets bigger and can handle more food. But at about when it's filled with about 1 liter of food, after that, any more than that will cause an increase in the pressure. You get reflexes that occur, events that are triggered by reflex action. There's the receptive relaxation of the stomach as food travels down the esophagus, and the stomach muscles will relax because of this reflex called the receptive relaxation. Adaptive relaxation there's a subtle difference. Food traveling down the esophagus and entering slowly into the stomach causes stomach muscles to relax, but the stomach filling itself, that allows the stomach to actually dilate or expand more. So that's the adaptive relaxation. There's receptive and adaptive. Receptive as it's receiving food, and adapting as it adapts to the presence of that space-filling food. Gastric contractile activity also is occurring in a regulated manner. As you fill the stomach, you have waves of peristalsis that are moving down through the esophagus and moving along the stomach, and that's shown by these arrows here, moving further and further down towards the pyloric end of the stomach. And the contractions are occurring at about 3 per minute, and you get this vigorous peristalsis that is occurring and mixing, particularly near in the pyloric region of the stomach, and helping the formation of chyme. Now the chyme will be delivered in small amounts into the duodenum as the pyloric sphincter, or pyloric valve, sphincter is a better term, relaxes and allows chyme to move into the duodenum. So chyme is delivered in small amounts, squeezes through just like a paste into through the open space of the relaxed pyloric valve and into the duodenum. If there's, if that at the same time that is happening, any contraction wave will push the food in both directions, into the duodenum, but also there's a back forcing or back movement here of food back further into the stomach for further mixing. Okay, so chyme is pushed forward or pushed backward, a lot depending upon the state of the pyloric valve, if it's open or closed. Carbohydrate-rich chyme can move quickly through the duodenum. However, if the food that you've been eating has a lot of fat in it, so you have a fat laden or fat-filled chyme, that's digested much more slowly and remains in the stomach longer, and actually remains in the duodenum longer because it has to undergo for more processing. And that's the end of Unit 8, Part 2.